We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Alors, bonjour, nous allons commencer la conférence.
Hello, we'll begin the conference. I'm Sarah Myriam Martin-Brûlé, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this first annual conference of the Strategic Network Analysis Axis 2. Presentations will be made in French and in English. We will therefore be offering simultaneous interpretation, which is available if you click on the icon at the bottom of your screen on the right. The Network for Strategic Analysis is a result of minds mobilizing insights in defense and scrutiny. This is the very first Minds network that's entirely bilingual. This network is co-led by Justin Massey of UQAM and Stephanie Van Hatley of Queen's University. The network brings together more than 80 researchers and practitioners and mobilizes the expertise of international collaborators, a scientific council, council of emerging researchers as well. The network's first mission is to mobilize Canadian and global expertise with respect to 3 strategic challenges for Canada. Axis 1 focuses on the changing role of major powers in the context of a new world order, and this is led by Jonathan Paquin of Laval University. Axis 2, which is led by myself, and within which this conference is taking place, is the axis that examines multilateral cooperation and international security. And Axis 3, the future of defense capacity building for global partners, which is led by Theodore McLaughlin at Université de Montréal. So we're mobilizing in both French and English innovative and multidisciplinary research in the field of defense and security in order to develop synergies and bring to the fore the voice of our experts. We're looking to disseminate the results of policy analysis to the Government of Canada, partner organizations, and the general public to inform policy decisions and inform public debate. We also aim to train the next generation of experts in security and defense. This conference, therefore, aims to meet these 3 objectives. Through a partnership with the Peace Operations Research Network, which is led by Marie-Joëlle Zahar of Université de Montréal, and the network Cerium, that we organize this conference on the theme of rethinking Canada's role in peacekeeping. In a world where multilateralism is profoundly tested, peacekeeping is an essential tool in managing international peace and security issues. Like any tool, it faces major challenges, including inconsistent support from the Security Council, limited means, difficulties linked with protecting civilians, and the intertwining of internal conflicts with the dynamics of transnational terrorism. Nevertheless, various organizations have taken up the tool. In Africa, where the UN has long been the main peacekeeping actor, ambitions and achievements of regional and sub-regional organizations, be it the G5 Sahel, the Economic Community of the Central African States, for instance, have enabled several of these stakeholders to carve out an important place for themselves in the management of peace and security on the continent. In Europe, NATO's involvement in peacekeeping, which has not been very problematic in the 90s and 2000s, is now complicated by the deep tensions between alliance members and Russia. With presence in both these geographic areas, Canada is closely associated with maintaining peace, and the current government is a strong supporter of multilateralism. Ottawa, however, was criticized for not being present in some geographical areas or for its limited contributions and for the choices it's made in its re-engagement. For a long time, Canada was associated with the Blue Helmets. In the context where Canada did not obtain a seat on the Security Council, how could Canada consider its position or its repositioning in the peacekeeping chessboard? To what extent Should we partake in peace operations, and should it be a priority for the government of Canada? Or should Canada intervene as a priority in some areas, and what should be the nature of its contribution? To reflect on these themes and answer these questions, to assess the extent and the manner in which Canada can distinguish itself in the field of peacekeeping, today's panelists will be invited to discuss the evolution of policies and practices, international organization, regional organizations, and sub-regional organizations, how to coordinate Canadian expectations to theirs. Today's conference is divided in two parts. In the morning, we have the great honor of welcoming professors and experts who will present their thoughts on this issue. The afternoon will be devoted to the next generation. Our aim is therefore twofold. On the one hand, to facilitate dialogue between practitioners and researchers, and on the other hand, to promote the next generation of defense and security experts, particularly on peacekeeping issues. I'd also like to point out that today's student presentations, who are all either at the master's or doctorate level, have all been selected through a call for papers. Their research and presentations will be commented by Dirk Drouet, a researcher affiliated with the Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University, and Marie-Joëlle Zahar, who is a professor of political science and director of the Peace Operations Research Network. Also by Laurence Deschamps-Laporte, who is a guest professor at the Department of Political Science at Université de Montréal and a guest researcher at the Centre d'études et de recherche internationale, or CERIUM. Justin Massy, who is a full professor at Université du Québec à Montréal and co-director of the Network for Strategic Analysis. I would invite you to read their bios on our site. I also wanted to underscore the importance of student involvement in drafting and communicating this conference. This conference was developed with the contributions of Corinne Doré, who's a student in international studies at Bishop University, John Rubayan, who's an MA candidate at political science, and Chloé Berland, who's a MA candidate in political science at Université de Montréal. So to begin the day, it's a great honor for me to introduce you to our four panelists. Our guests of honor today will speak in turn, and then we will ask you to move forward to the question period. Questions can be added in the box or asked orally in French and English. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll begin with a presentation by Mr. Anadif, Special Representative of the Secretary General in Mali, and he'll be followed by Professor Bruno Charbonneau, Professor at the Military College Saint-Jean, and Professor Wayne Gessim Wan, Professor at George Washington University, and Professor Lise Howard, Professor at Georgetown University. Georgetown University, yes. So, Mohamed Salet Anadif is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Mali and head of the United Nations Integrated Multidimensional Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA. Prior to his current position, he was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chad from 1997 to 2003, Chief of Staff for the President from 2004 to 2006, and Secretary General of the Presidency from 2010 to 2012. He also served as Permanent Representative of the African Union to the European Commission from 2006 to 2010. During his career, Mr. Anadif was involved in several peace processes in Africa, including Niger, Central African Republic, and Sudan. From 2012 to 2014, he was the Special Representative and head of the African Union mission in Somalia. Bruno Charbonneau is Associate Professor of International Studies and Director of the Center on Security and Crisis Governance at the Military College in Saint-Jean. He's also the founder and director of the Centre Franco-Paix en Résolution des Conflits et Missions de Paix of the Raoul Dandurand Chair in Université du Québec à Montréal. Since 2015, he's been a member of the editorial team of the prestigious journal International Peacekeeping. His work focuses on international interventions and armed conflicts. His research has been partially funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and by World Affairs Canada. Mr. Elgasim Weng is Professor of International Relations at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. From October 2017 to April 2019, he was Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the Chairperson of the African Union. From January 2016 to September 2017, he served as UN Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, and prior to that, he was Director of the Peace and Security Department of the African Union in Addis Ababa from 2009 to 2015, and he held a number of positions in the same union from 1994 to 2009, and he was the head of the Conflict Management Division as well as the spokesperson for the African Union on peace and security issues. Professor Lise Marjorie Howard is Professor of Politics at Georgetown University and Chair of the Academic Council on the UN System. She was the founding director of the Master of Arts program in Conflict Resolution at Georgetown and served as a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the American Peace Institute. Dr. Howard's research and teaching interests focus on international relations, comparative politics, and conflict resolution. Our focus is on civil war, peace operations, U.S. foreign policy, and fields of study with respect to Sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. In 2010, she received the Book Award from the Academic Council of the UN System, and as well, this year, in 2021, she received the Book Award from the International Security Studies section of the International Studies Association. And it's with great pleasure now that I will start the first session for today and give the floor over to Mr. Mohamed Saleh Anadif. And Professor, the floor is yours.
À vous.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to Ms. Miriam, Professor Miriam. First of all, I would like to welcome all of the friends that are gathered around this screen. I see many familiar faces. I would also like to thank the Network for Strategic Analysis for this kind invitation to participate in this discussion today on this annual conference on international organizations and multinational security. It is important for me to encourage this type of dialogue between the academic world and the practitioners on the ground when it comes to peacekeeping and also multilateral cooperation in terms of international security. I, amongst those who believe that there needs to be a multilateral approach to resolve conflicts and crises in general through peacekeeping or preventive diplomacy. And I believe that this approach remains a relevant one. It's got a great track record in spite of the complex and unpredictable environment in which we're evolving. I'm also happy to see that we're having this discussion from Canada. Canada is well known as a pioneer country in terms of peacekeeping, even if for a certain time now it is not been so present in terms of peacekeeping operations. I'm going to structure my presentation as follows. First of all, I'd like to talk about peacekeeping operations in general, and I won't draw a distinction between peacekeeping operations and political missions, because today most of the crises, virtually all of the conflicts where there are peacekeeping operations or political missions, as you know, are unfortunately deployed in African countries where either there's been a rupture of the constitutional order, for example, with the Central African Republic or Somalia, Mali, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also Libya to a certain extent, or else it's following a civil war, for example, with Darfur, or in South Sudan, or else there have been border conflicts. We've got Abyei, and we've got the Western Sahara there as well. The other characteristic of these missions is that initially many of these missions were deployed as classical peacekeeping operations. But over time, we've seen a rise of violent extremism, basically terrorism. And I wouldn't say it's become the main cause as such, but it's become the main symptom that we find reflected, for example, in Mali and in Somalia, and to a lesser extent, also in the DRC and also in the CAR with the M23 and the actions of the LRA. Therefore, I believe that this rise in violent extremism has really complicated the task for traditional peacekeeping missions because they constitute a real threat which is capable of destabilizing and even destroying the states and the real underpinnings of these states. As you know, terrorism, this type of terrorism is based on an asymmetric model, and they move around very easily, they're very mobile, and with very basic means, as we can see here in Mali, and with improvised explosive devices, or with booby traps in vehicles or belts that explode. It's very easy to manufacture this type of device, but it causes a great deal of significant damage. That gives them a certain number of advantages compared to these traditional peacekeeping missions. I'd like to recognize on this point that unlike what many people might say, even if the peacekeeping missions fall under the description of peacekeeping missions, they have actually evolved in their daily practices over time. They're continuing to adapt to the new reality, and that is the case with the mission that I lead here in Mali. There's another element that I'd like to emphasize here, namely the national capacity of the countries where the peacekeeping missions are actually deployed. The armies of these countries are unfortunately not trained up to face up to this type of asymmetric warfare, nor are they well equipped to be involved in this type of war. Another characteristic is that these wars or peacekeeping operations are very expensive. So that then begs the following question. There's not just the question of partnership, which is important, I believe, because it's a global threat. It's a threat to everyone. But I'd like to talk about certain types of partnerships that should be developed. Looking at a first type of partnership now, and I'll talk about Canada's role there, deals with the military aspect or security aspects. Namely, how can we ensure correct training and help African countries to have the right equipment which is adapted to these specific threats. And all of this should be aimed at helping countries to reconstruct well-trained armies that are also well-equipped, that have the right logistics. And of course, they have to take as their guiding light respect for human rights, because they have to put their populations at the heart of their actions. Often that is not the case. So basically, we need to train up professional armies. And they need to be inclusive armies, and I'd really like to underscore that word, inclusive. And as far as possible, they should be Republican in nature. Within this partnership framework, then, intelligence plays a crucial role. And of course, many countries in the North possess these new technologies that offer various partnership and cooperation possibilities. I know that there's a certain number of restrictions that need to be taken into account, and that's part of the problem that we find with some peacekeeping missions, where there's not always a true sharing of information that takes place. Now, earlier, I said that we need to put the populations at the heart of our intervention, because in terms of intelligence gathering, human intelligence, of course, plays an essential role here. We can only obtain this type of human intelligence if we actually reassure the population, and if we ensure that the army that we're training up is actually perceived to be a protective force rather than an army that brings in its wake lots of threats. Turning now to a second axis of cooperation that I'd like to underline. This comes back to what I said earlier. Basically, virtually in all of these countries, there's been a rupture, a break in the constitutional order when we have to intervene with a peacekeeping mission. That means that we need to have a political partnership as well. The deep-rooted cause for these crises often lies in intrinsic instability, because there's a lack of legitimacy, and the state is not sufficiently present amongst their populations that are often vulnerable populations. And then there's the question of bad governance that has to be mentioned, and a lack of appropriate reforms that are adapted to these countries' situations. So that means that these vulnerabilities are then exacerbated. I recognize that there's also problems of competition for resources, but we have to recognize that there's also external shocks, such as what happened in 2011 in Libya. So those were the deep-rooted causes. And now we're trying to cure certain symptoms. There are non-state armed groups involved, militia, terrorist organizations as well. This is where the political partnership has to actually step in, and we have to do our utmost to ask questions of this political governance and look at the issues surrounding elections. And that is where preventive diplomacy really kicks in. It has a significant role to play. Often those who are responsible for the missions have to exercise their good offices, and this plays an important role when it comes to political partnerships. Let's now turn to what Canada can do. I'd said earlier that Canada has been a pioneer. We had the Pearson Centre, which had a great deal of outreach throughout the world. That was a true example of this. But today, Canada still has, for example, the Kofi Annan Centre in terms of education and training, and also the peacekeeping school in Mali. And these are true examples of contributions that can be made and that need to be further reinforced, because training and education is an extremely important aspect here. Now, I'd said that peacekeeping or conflicts or wars all cost a great deal of money. So Canada has a role to play here as well, namely to support the countries that are contributing soldiers or police officers. We can support them in terms of the equipment, but we can also give support by offering technical expertise in terms of policing or specialized police forces. I'm based here in Mali, and I have seen how certain Canadian professionals have been able to play a helpful role to accompany and support the MINUSMA police. As you'll know, in a country such as Mali or Somalia, where I was also based in the past, we're talking about very vast territories where refueling often takes place by land, but often they're not tarmacked roads, and there's IEDs that cause a great deal of damage. For example, here we've got companies or battalions, for example, from Sri Lanka or from Egypt, who are well equipped so that they can actually accompany the convoys, because we have real problems with mines and improvised explosive devices. So that's one area where cooperation is possible. Now, I've said that it's necessary to have a political solution, and so there's a role that could be played by Canada as well to assist in drawing up certain policies. For example, what's happening with children in conflict zones. Canada developed the Vancouver Principles, and they can show a leadership role, be in the right place at the right time, drawing on the initiative from the UN Secretary General, namely Action for Peacekeeping. There, I can see a role to be played by Canada in the 34 group and the discussions on the budget for peacekeeping missions. But I can also see that Canadian experts have another role to play when it comes to the planning units, the analysis units, and also local policing services. There we can draw on Canadian expertise as well. The added value of a country such as Canada is that it's a bilingual country, and that's a real advantage in this world in which we operate. And secondly, it's a country that doesn't have a colonial past, which means it's easier for Canada to be accepted and be seen to be objective. And that's something that's very much welcomed, because it's an attractive factor which works in favor of Canada's participation. For example, in Mali, there's support of the Auditor General's office here in Mali, and that's a real model, because fighting against corruption is part of good governance. This also contributes to the good of the country. And I'm not going to talk about humanitarian projects, but Canada's also involved there. So by way of conclusion, I would like to say that we don't need to have boots on the ground with units and soldiers involved in the peacekeeping operations. It's true that in 2019, 2018, and 2017, we thought that Canada was going to come to countries such as Mali, but certainly you can still be involved in peacekeeping operations without having as many Canadians on the ground as you had back in the 1990s. We have been able to benefit from your air support with the Chinook Canadian helicopters who were here in 2018, 2019, and they did fantastic work. Because, as I said, there's a question of long-distance refueling or for medical evacuation operations and also for surveillance exercises where drones can play a role. The Chinook helicopters can play a significant role as well. So I think there's a whole array of cooperation that opens up to a country such as Canada. There's lots of opportunities out there. Of course, we have to heal these symptoms, but we have to also help African countries to rebuild their national armies. Because peacekeeping operations, one day or another, will actually leave the country after a certain amount of time, and you have to help the country to rebuild itself, become responsible, and that's a contribution that can really be played successfully by Canada. That is what I wanted to share, and thank you once again for having invited me to this discussion. Thank you very much, Special Representative, for this rich wealth of experience that you've just shared with us, drawing on your expertise and experience on the question of peacekeeping. Thank you very, very much. And now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Bruno, or Professor Bruno Charbonneau.
Thank you, Sarah Myriam. Thank you to you and your entire team for the invitation. Welcome, everyone. It's quite an honor for me to be here today. I was asked to discuss Canada's contribution to peacekeeping, more specifically Canada's contribution in the mission in Mali. To summarize my conclusions, I would say that the Canadian government managed in extremis to save the day thanks to the performance of Canadian troops. However, I would guard against celebrating, since the road to that success was sometimes painful, if not embarrassing. And I'd say that we quickly moved on to something else after that mission, but we can delve into this later. I would also add that peacekeeping operations is a sensitive topic in Ottawa, it would seem. As I understand, there's no longer any public discussion of peacekeeping. We also have to understand that Canada's involvement in Mali is not over, so I'm not trying to today give you a history that's ended of this mission. I would rather like to go back to what I've seen from 2012 forward by working on this topic, on MINUSMA. I'm really happy to see that there are so many students with us today that will also be sharing their research on the topic. So I'm really interested to see what they will have to say and what they will have discovered on the topic. So initially, I'd like to go back to the history behind the involvement of Canada in Mali, and then I'll move on to a few findings and conclusions regarding Canada, and as well on peacekeeping operations as a whole. So briefly, the story begins with the victory of the Liberal Party of Canada in the 2015 federal election. This victory comes with a powerful slogan, "Canada is back," were we told, and it wasn't clear where exactly Canada was coming back from. The symbolic value and electoral intent of this tagline, however, was unequivocal. Justin Trudeau's government wanted to set itself apart from Stephen Harper's foreign policy, announcing the end of the conservative interlude and the return to more liberal internationalist tradition, itself associated with a Canadian image as a middle power and good citizen of the world. In this vision of Canada's role, the United Nations represent the core of the liberal approach, and peacekeeping operations are a significant Canadian contribution, in theory, in any case. The Trudeau government then promised to re-engage in peacekeeping operations ultimately in the goal of obtaining a seat on the Security Council. So in 2016, we had to pick a mission. How would we contribute and where? Everything indicated that Mali was the ideal location. Federal government analysts, those to whom I spoke anyway, academics, experts, and even public needs as expressed to the UN were aligned to say that Mali was the place where Canada was probably best suited to intervene, where there could be positive impact. In my view, for Canada, the mission to Mali represented multiple diplomatic advantages because it allowed us to act on various fronts. The UN, of course, in the context that Mr. Anadif explained, in a French non-colonial country, African partners as well, such as French-speaking Africa, where there are a number of votes for the Security Council, and the opportunity to work with our European allies, many being vastly involved in Mali, and more specifically, France and the USA, that were hoping for a significant contribution from Canada to counter-terrorism efforts in Sahel. At the end of the day, what we were faced with was rather 2 years of endless analyses and insights, including many reconnaissance missions in Africa by the Canadian Armed Forces. Ministers visited Africa on many occasions and in many locations, but by the summer or fall of 2017, when many agencies and government stakeholders were ready to be deployed, the RCMP, or that's what we were told in Ottawa, RCMP, Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces, we were simply awaiting for the mission to be chosen, and the decision was postponed and postponed again. Came the Vancouver Summit in November 2017, which was an international forum meant to discuss future peacekeeping operations. At the time, I believe everyone expected an announcement that Vancouver would be the forum where the mission would be divulged. Once again, to the surprise and disappointment of many, the decision did not come in Vancouver. Rather, we were treated to announcements of projects, certainly valid and useful, but minor in scope, and that certainly did not meet the urgent needs as identified by the UN for Canada. In my opinion, Vancouver is an embarrassing moment for Canadian diplomacy. Frustrations came from everywhere. Certainly New York, Paris, Bamako, and elsewhere. I've heard many people express their frustration, and certainly within the government of Canada as well. So at the end of the day, what happened was that we got direct calls from Germany and Denmark directly to the Prime Minister's office to convince him in March 2018 to send troops to Mali as part of MINUSMA. The commitment is very far from the promises of 2015. We'd spoken to 650 soldiers or so, and at the end of the day, Canada will send an effective group. However, they will only be comprised of 250 soldiers and 2 or 8 helicopters for a very limited period of about 12 months. And I believe at the end it was extended by 3 months to ensure a transition. At least this contribution was a success from the operational standpoint. That's perhaps where Canada didn't entirely fail. A mobile tactical support mission that enabled European and UN troops to extend their field of action, and the actions of Canadian soldiers were much appreciated by all, but I remain convinced that Canada could have done much more. So a few findings very quickly. Firstly, with respect to the decision-making process, and here I have to say that I don't want to be too categorical because I'm not in the best position to come to a very firm conclusion. As I said, Canadian history in Mali and the decision to send troops is still unknown, but it's difficult not to conclude that the hesitation, or indeed the lack of decision-making, came from the PMO. So it's hard for me to see things otherwise. I'm not sure where the hesitation came from other than from the PMO. Secondly, as I said a little bit earlier, Canada likes to see itself as a peacekeeper. This myth of the blue helmet, now this myth has certainly lost some of its luster over the past 20 years. But the most important point here that I'd like to underscore is not so much that, but rather what I've seen on an institutional level, the lack of and loss of institutional memory and expertise with respect to what peacekeeping actually is within the Canadian government. There was certain arrogance by some stakeholders within the PMO that wanted to revolutionize peacekeeping. We were told at the time that peacekeeping was going awry, but somehow Canada was going to radically change peacekeeping operations thanks to this Canadian expertise acquired over many years. Now, many conversations led to us wondering how much understanding there was of peacekeeping, not only in Mali, but, and I'll be leaving that to the side for now, but I've had many astonishing conversations with senior officials who seemed to think that peacekeeping operations no longer existed, that now we were rather dealing with peace support operations. Now, I was but an observer of the impact of semantics and post 9/11 military interventions, and the experience in Afghanistan of Canada was obvious. So as I said, I was just an observer. So finally, to link back to peacekeeping operations and the issue of the day, as I see it on the program in any case, a Canadian official recognized that in his assessment, NATO armies were all imbued with a specific system and thinking that caused a major problem and were at odds with the structure of the mission. So if you know what I've been researching, you know that counterterrorism, in my view, needs to be debated. Now, I've written extensively on the problems of counterinsurgency and the practice of peacekeeping, but I think that these things aren't necessarily at odds, and one does not exclude the other. In my opinion, there's no binary choice. There's three reasons for this. Firstly, there are possible hybrid solutions, such as in Mali, Somalia as well. There's also this willingness to intervene in ongoing conflicts to impose stability. So peacekeeping by the UN was not designed for that. What can we do if leaders believe that we have to use force? This is where regional forces sometimes get involved with peacekeeping operations. And thirdly, in practice, often strengthening regional forces usually leads to strengthening future peacekeeping, including the rehatting process, as it's designated, which means changing the color of the helmet to the UN blue. So I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you. I'm sure we will have questions. Thank you for your thoughts. That will certainly bring about lots of debate and lots of ideas and questions. And now I'll be moving over to Professor Elghassim Wane.
Thank you very much. Of course, there's lots of different opinions to be expressed during this webinar. And I'm going to speak in French because I prepared my presentation in English, even if I'm actually a Francophone. Is that okay? Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation to take part in this webinar. I believe it's a timely event that will help us reflect further on how particular countries, in this instance Canada, can better engage in peacekeeping, which undoubtedly is one of the most critical tools in the pursuit of ensuring peace and security, while also being a key component of multilateralism. I would like from the outset to answer the question put forward to us in this session: should Canada invest more in the United Nations or in African regional and sub-regional organizations? I would say that this, as Bruno also said, that this is not an either or question. Canada should invest in both as part of a coherent and comprehensive approach to peace and security challenges on the continent. And to explain why Canada should do so requires that I spend a bit of time on the overall backdrop against which policy should be set and implementation steps taken. And three key elements should be kept in mind here. One, the complexity of the peacekeeping arena in Africa. Second, the continued relevance of UN peacekeeping. And third, the emergence of a division of labor between the UN and African actors. And it is at the interface of these three contextual factors that Canada should seek to define a role for herself. Let me start with the complexity of Africa's peacekeeping landscape. I think it's a complexity, of course, first of the situations at hand, for sure, as they involve a number of factors linked to state and capacity building, the nature of the social contract between the state and the citizenry, and related governance challenges, and I spoke to that, terrorism and violent extremism, but also complexity arising from the diversity of the actors engaged in peacekeeping, and I would like to focus on that last aspect. When one looks at the continent, I think the last 2 decades or so have seen the relevant African institutions playing an increasingly important role in the promotion of peace and security on the continent. And this trend is a direct result of the advent of the African peace and security architecture, which paved the way for the development of a rich normative and institutional framework geared towards conflict management and conflict resolution. And while fully operationalizing APSA, the acronym of the architecture, is in some respects still a work in progress, important milestones have been laid that enabled the concerned African institutions to display undeniable dynamism. And nowhere is this more true than in the deployment of peace support operations. African PSOs have been marked by a great deal of variety in size, as they range from small observer missions to large-scale operations involving thousands of uniformed personnel. AMISOM is an example. Variety in duration, with some lasting few months, while others span over many, many years, or just being currently the AU mission in Somalia, which is now in its 14th year. A variety in mandate, with some operations bearing the hallmarks of traditional peacekeeping, particularly when it comes to the use of force, while others went well beyond the outer edges of peacekeeping, aiming in some instances to forcefully dislodge rebel elements and restore state authority. That was the case in Comoros, in the operation called Opération Démocratie aux Comores, and in others aiming at neutralizing terrorist groups, as is the case with AMISOM. And finally, a variety in modalities, as in some operations, the AU assumed full control from planning to the execution, whereas in others, the role of the AU is more limited. And the proactiveness I spoke about regarding the AU extends also to the regional mechanisms for conflict prevention, management, and resolution. And there are a number of examples that could illustrate that. The ECOWAS operation in Mali in 2013, which transitioned into an AU operation and eventually into a UN operation, MINUSMA, the military intervention, ECOWAS again in the Gambia in the wake of the post-electoral crisis of December 2017. And ECOWAS in actual fact has been involved in peace support operations in the early 90s, and as such has played a pioneering role. Another organization that has shown dynamism is ECAS, which intervened in the Central African Republic, MICOPAX, which became later an AU mission, MISCA, and then a UN mission, MINUSCA, since September 2014. And another example one could also refer to is the SADC intervention in Lesotho through what is called the SADC Prevention Mission to Lesotho, which was mandated to facilitate a secure, stable, and peaceful environment conducive to the rule of law. Now, in parallel to all these operations and outside the formal framework of the African peace and security architecture, the past few years have been characterized by the increasing recourse to ad hoc coalitions. And here I should maybe add that the term ad hoc may be misleading, as some of the arrangements in question are well institutionalized. And I would like maybe to make mention here of the Multinational Joint Task Force, which has been mandated since 2015 to combat the Boko Haram terrorist groups, and the G5 Sahel Joint Force, which was launched in 2017, but also the Regional Task Force for the Elimination of the Lord Resistance Army, which has been in existence since 2011. And they present a number of features. I would like to highlight three in particular. First, they do not conform to the geography of the regional standby forces that are the building blocks of the African standby force, but rather mirror the geography of the threat they seek to address, which is mostly linked to terrorism. And this has generated of recent academic interest in APSA spatial reordering and the way in which this process is shaping actors' position vis-a-vis each other. The second feature is that more often than not, these ad hoc coalitions operate under the direct authority of their member countries and not the AU. There is one notable exception, the Regional Task Force against the LRA. And the third element is that all these ad hoc coalitions have been mandated by the AU Peace and Security Council, and such mandating is deemed to be very important in terms of legitimization, but also for the mobilization of international support. There is a debate among analysts on whether or not the creation of this ad hoc coalition should be seen as signaling the flexibility of APSA, most notably its ability to adjust to evolving threats, or rather as signaling the unsuitability of APSA in the face of new challenges. Coordination challenges notwithstanding, it seems to me that the trend towards the establishment of ad hoc coalitions is in actual fact consistent with APSA premises and policies, including as articulated in the February 2004 Common African Defense and Security Policy and the January 2005 Pact on Non-Aggression and Common Defense. And this became clearer over time with the explicit acknowledgement of the need to loosen APSA's initial geography, which broadly speaking organized Africa in 5 regions: Central, East, North, South, and West. Now, while African organizations have been undeniably active, one should not also lose sight of the challenges confronting them. There are two which are critical, I think, for the purpose of our discussion. The first is the challenge of funding. UN missions are sustainably financed, reliant as they are on access contributions, and this is not the case for African missions, which depend on voluntary contributions availed mostly by international partners. The European Union plays a key role here with its Africa Peace Facility, which has been the main financing vehicle for operations undertaken under the APSA formal framework, as well as for those carried out by ad hoc coalitions under the APF, which will be absorbed into a newly established European Peace Facility. A total of 2.7 billion euro has been spent on peace and security issues in Africa between 2004 and 2019, including 1.9 billion euro on AMISOM alone for the period 2007-2019. The UN also provides significant support. As far as AMISOM is concerned, the Security Council has established a support package funded by UN access contribution, totaling $500 million last year, and efforts to expand this arrangement to other missions undertaken with the consent of the UN Security Council came to a head in December 2018 in New York, bringing to the fore differences within the three African members of Security Council, but also among Security Council members. The issue has not regained momentum since then, and it doesn't seem that immediate progress will be made on this issue. The second aspect, which is important, is linked to compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law. This, of course, is a requirement for all peace operations, but one that is made even more imperative for counter-terrorist operations, such as those carried out by the AU in Somalia and the G5 Joint Force in the Sahel. Indeed, in such operation, the likelihood of unintended harm to populations is higher, with the attendant risk of driving a wedge with the very people who support is crucial to the successful conduct of counter-terrorist operations. Efforts have been made in this respect by the AU, including the adoption of a compliance and accountability framework for AU PSOs, whereas in the Sahel, the UN and the EU are providing support to the G5 Joint Force in the implementation of a compliance framework with a view to preventing harm in the conduct of offensive military operations. Now, as I indicated earlier, the fact that African organizations are increasingly involved in peace support operations did not lead to a diminished UN role, but rather to its transformation. Of the current 12 UN operations deployed worldwide, 6 are operating in Africa. And these count among the largest, the only large operation outside Africa that somehow compare to those deployed on the continent is UNIFIL in Lebanon, which has the size of about 11,000 personnel, but only about half of the budget of large missions such as MONUSCO, MINUSCA, ADMIS, and MINUSMA. And in again, this backdrop of increased role by African institutions, continued relevance of UN peacekeeping, the two organizations have developed several and at times very innovative cooperation arrangements. And when one looks at the 2 most recent UN operations, it is striking that they took over from African-led operations, MISMA in Mali and MISCA in Central African Republic. African institutions went in first, given that conditions were not in place for the deployment of a UN peacekeeping operation. And in each of these 2 cases, the inability of African institutions to sustain their own operations and expand them to meet the needs of the ground precipitated what would otherwise have been a longer transition to the UN. In Darfur, where this kind of transition was not possible due to the opposition of the Sudanese government of the time, the AU and the UN resorted to an innovative solution, a hybrid operation. In the DRC and in South Sudan, the need for greater robustness in carrying out some specific tasks combined with limitations on the African side and political considerations led to the establishment within MONUSCO and ADMIS, respectively, of the Force Intervention Brigade and the Regional Protection Force. Elsewhere, in the pursuit of tasks that fell beyond the remit of peacekeeping, the UN response has centered around lending political but also operational support to operations undertaken by African entities. This is the case in Somalia, as indicated above, but also in Mali, where MINUSMA is providing operational support to the G5 Joint Force, although this support is not financed through access contributions. What are the key conclusions and way forward for Canada based on this? First, all the points I made illustrate that the UN, what the UN has described a few years ago as the era of partnership peacekeeping. There is a realization that neither the AU and its regional mechanism nor the UN can on their own effectively address the plurality of peace and security challenges confronting the African continent. As a matter of fact, African and UN operations are mutually supportive and closely intertwined, as the latter increasingly takes over from the former. It is clear that in this context, the success of follow-on UN operations depend to a significant extent on the gains made by their African predecessor. And relatedly, many of the UN operations are mandated to foster political processes spearheaded by African actors. And even in situations where the UN is unlikely to take over, such as in Somalia and the Sahel, there is a close link between the African entities involved and the UN. In Somalia, the success of the political process in which the UN plays a key role is contingent upon the improvement in the security situation. Conversely, progress in the political process will positively impact the security situation. In Mali, MINUSMA and the joint force operate in the same theater, and advances made by any of these two operations is beneficial to both. And finally, while some types of operations are likely to remain the exclusive preserve of African regional organizations, for instance, the operation conducted by ECOWAS in the Gambia, the endorsement of Security Council is critical and actively sought given the legitimacy it bestows on such regional initiative. For Canada, therefore, the issue is not a binary choice between engaging in UN peacekeeping or supporting African regional and sub-regional organizations, but rather doing both at the same time in a manner that maximizes synergies and improves overall effectiveness. Such engagement by Canada should, in my view, be multifaceted to the extent possible, and resources permitting, it should involve contributing capabilities to UN operations in Africa through personnel and logistics, but also extending support to African-led peace support operations, including capability development, mission management, and the implementation of compliance frameworks. Equally critical is the provision of political support to efforts aimed at further enhancing the partnership between the UN and the AU in confronting common challenges and adjusting their instruments and modus operandi to Africa's evolving peace and security landscape. Much has been achieved in this respect, but continued engagement by UN member states, including Canada, will be crucial to making further progress. Beyond peacekeeping per se, it is important that partner countries and institutions, including Canada, devise ways and means of more effectively supporting African efforts directed at the underlying causes of violence and instability. Since the turn of the century, the AU and its regional mechanisms have developed a rich normative and institutional framework on governance, laying the foundation to what some analysts have termed as the increasing Africanization of domestic governance, which is understood as a collective effort to imagine and organize a political project based on a continentally defined identity. While this process is not without challenges, subjected as it is to contestation and conflicting perspectives, the progress made cannot be underestimated, and there is an untapped potential. Supporting the African institutions involved in this process and assisting African countries in the implementation of the commitment they have made will go a long way in furthering the goals of prevention and peace building. I thank you.
Thank you so very much for a fascinating and so insightful presentation. I will now turn to Professor Lise Howard.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to my colleagues for their interventions. I'm going to share my screen because I think that will be, okay, host has disabled participant screen sharing. Can somebody enable my screen sharing? There we go. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you. My colleagues have resumed very nicely. They have summarized the big questions that we're dealing with today, the political and operational debates, the history of Canada in peacekeeping, the history of continental AU and regional engagements in peacekeeping and related types of missions. And I think the best way for me to contribute to this debate is to talk more about the literature about peacekeeping, which sounds, and especially the main findings, which I know sounds like it could be very boring because I'm going to talk about the statistical findings, but I promise you I am not going to show any graphs. I'm just going to resume to give a summary of the main findings. because they're worth taking a look at. We have a lot of scientific studies, and when you're in a peacekeeping mission, it generally feels, I think, like things are not working. Like this could not possibly be working, or maybe somewhat on the margin it's working. But if you look broadly at the results of peacekeeping, they are striking. And there really is very little question. So I'm going to, I started to organize this presentation in French, and then I realized that ça pourrait poser des problèmes, donc je vais le faire en anglais si ça vous gêne pas trop.
It might be problematic, so I'll be speaking English instead.
To talk about some basic correlations between peacekeeping and civilian deaths, talk about sexual exploitation and abuse and gender-based violence, the main statistical findings, some other findings. I'll talk about the completed missions, the African contributions to UN peacekeeping, which are already very significant, and then conclude. So to begin, arguably the most important part of peacekeeping mandates today, especially the multidimensional peacekeeping, the stabilization mandates, is the protection of civilians. So the question is, are peacekeepers protecting civilians? And the answer is a resounding yes. There is no doubt. We have 14 quantitative studies now conducted by scholars from different continents, measuring peacekeeping in different ways, measuring civilian deaths in different ways. These scholars have different funding streams, they're using different controls, and they're all finding the same thing, even when they're not asking the question of whether peacekeepers are protecting civilians. All of these studies, they have been published and vetted in the top journals of political science. And they have all found that all else equal, UN peacekeepers are protecting civilians. Where UN peacekeepers are deployed, there are fewer civilian deaths. When you compare in all types of ways, it's the same finding again and again, even controlling for everything you can imagine. So, and we also know that the more peacekeepers, more UN peacekeepers we have, and the more diverse UN peacekeepers we have, we also have fewer civilian deaths. So there's a question of diversity. Somehow, when you have different countries contributing different areas of expertise to UN peacekeeping, you see more success in protecting civilians. Now, okay, I'm gonna keep going through. So we also, when we have more peacekeepers, we also have fewer military deaths. So it's not just that peacekeepers are preventing civilian death, they're also preventing military deaths. And now I want to turn to this question of sexual abuse and exploitation, because it's a serious one, obviously, in peacekeeping. The last two and most important studies looking at gender-based violence and peacekeeping find that peacekeepers are not only protecting lives, they are also preventing rape and other forms of gender-based and sexual violence during war. So where you have peacekeepers, we have less sexual and gender-based violence in war. Where we have UN peacekeepers, these are all tests about UN peacekeepers. I should also note in here, most of these studies do not include African Union missions or sub-regional missions because there are so few of them. What we have are many, many peacekeeping missions and much data about the peacekeeping missions, but less about the AU and sub-regional missions. Okay, so we know that peacekeepers are preventing sexual and gender-based violence, but we also know for anyone who's participated in a peacekeeping mission that there is increased sex trafficking around peacekeeping missions, that we have increased prostitution when the UN deploys peacekeeping missions. And this is obviously a problem that runs counter to the very mission of what the UN is trying to do. So that very clearly, the problem of transactional sex, of prostitution, must be addressed in peacekeeping. We know also that the more women who participate in peacekeeping, the less abuse and the less sexual exploitation we have in peacekeeping. But I would argue that we will never have many women participating in peacekeeping because Peacekeepers rely, of course, on country contributions for troops, and very few militaries have large numbers of women in them. And so it's a question of changing the culture. It's not simply a question of adding women and stirring. It's a question of changing the culture of peacekeeping missions to disallow that type of behavior. Some other findings in the literature. We all know that civil war tends to spread like a disease. We've been talking a lot about disease and COVID, and in some ways, civil war is a similar phenomenon. Once it starts in a part of a country, it can spread in the country, it can spread across borders, but we have several, well, 4 now, very definitive studies that show that violence spreads less across borders, especially when UN peacekeepers are present. We also have a significant number of studies that show that we know that civil wars recur, right? Once the civil war begins and you end it, it begins again. But when UN peacekeepers are present, there is less recurrence of civil war. Civil wars tend to be shorter when UN peacekeepers are present also. So these are more findings. Most of these are actually books. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a ton of quantitative studies that show that peacekeepers produce better post-conflict institutions, more robust institutions in the rule of law, in policing, in security sector, promoting participation in a variety of ways. We also have this new study that came out at the end of last year that demonstrates that when you have UN peacekeepers, you have more robust civil society growth, a growth and activity of civil society. And I think anyone who's been, for example, in DRC or in the Central African Republic, in the Central African Republic is where I've been conducting field research mainly for the last 5 years, that civil society is actually growing. It's not necessarily because the peacekeepers are trying to grow to help civil society grow, but it is a result of the presence of UN peacekeepers. Now, turning to the completed missions since the end of the Cold War, I would argue that there have been 16 completed large peacekeeping missions. So the UN has completed 71 missions overall, but of the similar large multidimensional missions, the ones that had really broad mandates, the UN's completed 16 of them. And 11 of them, I would argue the UN has implemented most aspects of the mandate and departed. And I just want to contrast, so that's about a 2/3 success rate. And I want to contrast that with counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency as a form of intervention has been decreasing in effectiveness over the last 100 years. It's not just Somalia or Iraq or Afghanistan. This has been a phenomenon that has been building in the international system for a long time. Counterinsurgency is not an effective form of intervention. And I would like just to contrast that for a moment with peacekeeping, right? So peacekeeping that has the 3 rules of peacekeeping: consent, impartiality, and the limited use of force. So if we look at the missions, the failed and the successful missions, I think we are all very familiar, and especially in Canada, I think that Canadians are especially familiar with the painful memories of Rwanda and to a certain extent Bosnia. But peacekeeping has really changed since Bosnia. There has not been another genocide where UN peacekeepers are deployed in over 25 years. So where there are UN peacekeepers, we have not seen another instance of genocide. And I would argue in the Central African Republic, we probably would have had a genocide had not the AU and France and the UN intervened. So we have this list of the failed missions. This is the list of the successful missions. And I would like to say 2 words about Cambodia. This is the mission that I think has most relevance for today. Especially when we're thinking about Mali and to a certain extent, the Central African Republic and probably Somalia. In Cambodia, Vietnam intervened with 200,000 troops to try to defeat Khmer Rouge. 200,000 troops could not defeat the Khmer Rouge, this extremist organization. What did defeat the Khmer Rouge was an undermining of their ideas of legitimacy. What defeated the Khmer Rouge was a UN peacekeeping mission that came in with elections and convinced Cambodians that this was the way forward. And the Khmer Rouge imploded. The Khmer Rouge only got stronger when they were confronted with military force, and they were defeated when they were confronted with another way of engaging in politics. And that, I think, is an important lesson. We want to learn from the successful cases. What were the sources of success? And this is the time in history when extremist movements have been defeated is not when they're confronted with military force, but when they're confronted with better ideas. Okay, so I wanted to say one more thing about peacekeeping when we're talking about whether Canada should contribute to UN peacekeeping or regional peacekeeping. I can't answer that question. I'm a professor. I'm not a policy-oriented person. Given that I hold 2 passports, American and French, I'm the last person who's going to tell Canada what to do. But I will say this. Peacekeeping is already African. UN peacekeeping is already African. So we have historically, actually, this is a better way to show it. Historically, through most of our time in dealing with peacekeeping, it's been India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh that have been the lead peacekeeping countries. And we see this in the dark blue line, that the South Asian countries have contributed the most troops. But in 2013, the continent overtook South Asia. So African troops now make up the majority of UN peacekeepers, right? So there are more African peacekeepers contributing to UN missions than from anywhere else in the world. In other words, UN peacekeeping is already African. And so it's just something to keep in mind as we move forward, that if we're choosing between the AU and regional organizations, this is already happening. Okay, so to summarize, UN peacekeeping has been effective. It's been strikingly effective. As a form of intervention, it is something we have never, there is no statistical equivalent to what even if it seems like it's never working, it actually is saving lives. Africans are already UN peacekeepers. And I would just say that UN peacekeeping is a worthy investment because of how effective it has been. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Howard, for a very convincing presentation on how peacekeeping as a tool is indeed working, and on so many aspects, not only when there is intervention, but after as well, the intervention of peacekeepers. I really appreciated this tour d'horizon of the state of the research right now.